Good day, everybody. Randy Franklin Smith here. Today, we're diving into another area of Active Directory security, and we're going to focus on privileged accounts and finding those privileged accounts and implementing controls over them. I want to thank Netrix for being our sponsor for this Real Training for Free session. And with me from Netrix is Jennifer Tofan. And Jennifer, thanks a lot for making this session possible. And I know you've got some really good technology that maps directly to some of the issues that come up in today's session.
Absolutely, and thanks so much for having us too. I'm really excited to listen to what you have to say as well as show the technology that we have.
All right, well, I'm going to kind of divide this into three sections. First of all, we're going to talk about all of the routes to privileged access in Active Directory. And as you can guess, there are a lot. Some of them are very obvious, some of them less so. But we need to understand all of them. We need to have a handle on all of them. And some of them can be quite challenging to figure out, as you'll see. We'll look at key controls to implement and also key ways to assess your risks here. And then finally, a lot of what we need is visibility. So much of the actual effort involved in dealing with these risks depends on how much visibility you have into your infrastructure and how much you have to manually root around in there to uncover everything. So I'm going to take each one of these one by one, but let's just give you a quick overview of all the different ways you can get privileged access in Active Directory. Now, the first thing that most people think of are the obvious built-in groups that come with Active Directory out of the box, such as domain admins, administrators, enterprise admins, account operators, and so on. And interestingly enough, as simple as that may seem, over and over again, in fact, I would be hard-pressed to think of an audit or security assessment that we've done of Active Directory, Jennifer, where even the organizations that probably had it together the most, we didn't come up with something surprising in terms of a member of one of these groups. And oftentimes it's through a circuitous route. But I bet you run into the same thing with your users, because once you start nesting groups and using groups from different domains, it gets confusing very quickly.
Yeah, that for sure, and definitely having a way to kind of spill out that effective membership with the nesting, super important in terms of keeping your privileged accounts in check.
So I'll talk about that more here in a second. Then we have something else called user rights in Windows. Sometimes they're called system privileges. Regardless, these are certain system-wide capabilities or authorities that can be granted, and there are a number of them that we designate as admin equivalent. And so we'll show you how those are granted, what they allow, and how we have to control them. We're also going to talk about the extremely important subject of workstations. So your privileged users in AD, your Active Directory admins, what computers are they logging on at? What else is happening on those workstations? I tell you, I think in today's environment, this is probably one of the most important things. And I'll show you why. Then, what about non-domain controller infrastructure applications upon which Active Directory has a security dependency? I'll explain what I mean by that. Then there's also permissions on individual Active Directory objects. And there are specific permissions on certain sensitive objects that we've got to keep an eye on. And this can be, again, one of the most unclear or least obvious ways that somebody can have admin authority. Virtualization infrastructure, we'll talk about that. And then at least we'll give honorable mention to physical access of domain controllers. In fact, let's do that right now. So in previous days, it was a lot easier to exploit physical access to a Windows system, including domain controllers. Microsoft has made it increasingly difficult, which is good news. But at the end of the day, the fundamentals remain the same. And one of the fundamentals of computer security is if you have physical access to a system, then there's a way for you to get in, one way or another. I will say it's a lot more difficult than it used to be. And then with domain controllers, of course, if we have physical access to a domain controller, then ultimately we could gain access to everything in that domain, potentially that forest. Now, sometimes read-only domain controllers are put forward as a solution to domain controllers that have to be at sites where you don't have commensurate physical security as with your data center. However, I really caution against putting too much reliance upon RODCs, read-only domain controllers, because remember, the secrets are all there. It's just changes made on a read-only domain controller are not going to replicate throughout the rest of the domain. But the secrets, you know, the password hashes, etc., KRB, TGT, the key of that are all still there. So the best defense is secure boot if you're using modern versions of Windows for your domain controllers, which is essentially a beefed up implementation of BitLocker based upon TPM, you know, along with the UEFI secure boot functionality. So let's not spend more time on physical access of domain controllers. Let's go and talk about groups. So the major groups that you need to watch in every domain is the local administrators group, the domain global domain admins group. Then if this is the first domain of the forest, that is the root domain of the forest, you also have a group called enterprise admins. A better name for that would have been forest admins, because that's really what it is. If you're a member of enterprise admins, then you are also a member of administrators in each one of the other domains within the forest. There's also a group called account operators, and that basically gives you all access to users and groups within the domain, which is pretty close to being a domain admin. And then another really important one is group policy creator owners. So that group has access to group policy objects. And if we can edit a group policy object that is applied to a domain controller, then we are basically a domain admin because we can reconfigure the security of that domain controller. And since that domain controller is hosting Active Directory, it's, you know, we for all intents and purposes have admin access to the domain. There's a number of other admin and operator groups within Active Directory, and I would treat all of these as highly privileged accounts. So obviously, we want to manage the membership of these groups, but the thing with Windows, of course, and Active Directory in particular, Active Directory allows you to nest groups. So that means we can make Group A a member of Group B and so on. And so, you know, just think about the fact that if Bob is a member of this group that we've created, that group can be a member of, you know, a group within the same domain. And then that group, depending on if it's universal or global, can be a member of, groups on other domains. And it quickly can get out of control. So group nesting is powerful. Group nesting is something that we want to use because there are some powerful things that we can do to really get some rules or policy-based access control implemented. But at the same time, if we take it too far, we will end up with users that have admin authority that we never intended. And it goes without saying, a reporting tool that can collapse all these nested group memberships down and show you really what is the extended membership of this domain admins group is really valuable. The other thing that we'll want to do is alert on changes to these groups, but I'll talk about that more when we get into controls and assessment. I just want to show you an example of this kind of group nesting. And if we bring up Bob here, so bear in mind that Bob is a member of, let's go back in there. Let's put Bob in group 1. So now Bob is a member of group 1. Group 1 is a member of domain admins. So there's an example right there, very simple group nesting. But as you can see, there's no way you're going to be able to keep track of this by just clicking through and bouncing between users and groups in AD. The other thing that I want you to think about is who has access to Bob's account. That will come up later on in the webinar, but just think about that for a second. Is it only the members of the built-in groups that have that kind of access? We'll see. So again, right now I'm just enumerating, I'm showing you all the different routes to admin authority. We're going to come back and revisit this to talk about what should we do for controlling these risks and implementing appropriate preventive and detective controls. So the next route to admin authority is admin equivalent rights on domain controllers. So you'll see here, I'm in a group policy object and I'm specifically in the default domain controllers policy object. So this is by default the main group policy object that controls the configuration of your domain controllers. And since they're the domain controllers, you're basically, you are controlling the configuration of the Windows systems hosting Active Directory. Just to show you where we are within the overall environment. And I want to point out something else here. So by default, Active Directory has 2 group policy objects out of the box. One is linked to the root of the domain. That specifies certain domain level settings that are only applicable at the domain level, but also that becomes the default policy for all computers within the domain. But then down here on the domain controllers organizational unit, which is where all of your domain controllers by default appear and should stay there, you also have the default domain controllers policy. And of course, anything configured here is going to override GPOs defined above unless you specify overrides on those overrides, but that's a topic for another day. So if we go into that group policy object and look at its user rights assignments, a number of these are what we call admin equivalent. And since this GPO is applied to all the domain controllers, then whoever is assigned these rights is of course going to have those rights on each one of the domain controllers. And these are the current set of rights that should be considered admin equivalent. It's been a little while since Microsoft updated the list of what they specifically call out as admin equivalent. So you may see that I've added a couple others that I believe should be included in the latest versions of Windows. Let me just run through them, some of them at least, quickly. Act as part of the operating system. The best way I could define that is, if you are familiar with Linux, Unix security at all, you can SU to root. So that's very similar to the authority that you get here. You basically get to run with the same authority as the kernel. Backup files and directories, that allows you to get access, read access to any object on the system, regardless of the permissions on that object. The opposite of that right is restore files and directories. But that then allows you to replace any object on the system. So you can see the power of those. Debug programs, that's a very powerful right, because that allows you to get into and inject code to run inside privileged processes. And that's very much a technique that tools like, I suddenly can't remember the name of, I'll think of it later, but it's a very popular, white hat hackers tool. I'll think of it as I go along. The other few that maybe I'd point out is load and unload device drivers. Device drivers run at such a low level, such a privileged level within the OS. That then again allows you to circumvent the rest of the security controls that provide the integrity and security of Active Directory. So the bottom line is, there's seldom a need to change the default assignments of these rights, but you'd be surprised how many times in a security assessment, we look at these rights and we find things that are inexplicable. As one example, there was the case where we found everyone with the act as part of the operating system right, and that was pretty amazing, because at the end of the day, that means anybody in the entire domain, and this was the main domain of the forest, had basically had admin rights to the entire domain. And then since this was the forest root domain, that then meant that they could obtain admin authority anywhere else in the domain. So that was pretty crazy. Next route to admin authority in Active Directory. So everything in Active Directory is an object, and in Windows, every object has an access control list or permissions that define what you can do to that object. And really, that's where the groups that we talked about at the beginning of this session, that's where they get their authority. There's not much, if anything, that is hard-coded or special about the administrators group or enterprise admins or domain admins. It's just that they, by default, they're automatically granted certain permissions to the users and groups, group policy objects, organizational units within your domain. And there's nothing that prevents an admin from going in and making changes to those permissions. And there's a lot of good reasons for doing it. This is the key way that we can delegate admin authority in Active Directory and do it in a granular, least privileged way. We can, for instance, give the help desk just password reset authority over the user accounts for whom they are responsible. So this is a good thing, but again, it can be done incorrectly, or it can be abused. So let's go look at exactly what I'm talking about here. So we can take any object, and remember I called out the Bob account to you. So if we go to Security, Advanced, we're now looking at the access control list for Bob. And let's be clear, these are the permissions on Bob's account. These are not the permissions that define what Bob can do. These are the permissions that define what other user accounts can do to Bob's account. So just think about it. The permissions on a file, that doesn't control what the file can do, that controls who can access the file. So users are objects in AD, groups are objects in AD, to some degree, just like files at a conceptual level. And so, you can see obvious things that you would expect here, like domain admins has full control of Bob. That makes sense. Account operators, remember I called that one out to you, that has full control. Oh, but look at that one. Allow everyone reset password authority on Bob's account. So, do you see how buried that can be? That's just one entry on one user account in the domain. But given the fact that Bob is a privileged user, he's a member of Group 1, and Group 1 is a member of domain admins, what could we say about this domain then? Everybody in the domain, every account, and not just every account in this domain, because everyone means all users that have authenticated. There's not much difference between everyone and authenticated users. So that would include, what I'm getting at is, everyone includes users from anywhere else in the forest or any other externally trusted domains. So absolutely everybody that can log on and authenticate to this domain ultimately has admin authority, because they could reset Bob's user account, then log on as Bob and exploit his membership in the domain admins group. Now, that's just user accounts. You'll notice here on the slides that we also need to think about groups. So with groups, the really important permission is the right permission to the member's property. Let me show you exactly what we're referring to there. Let's see here. We're looking at a group right now, Group 1. We go to Security, Advanced, and then we could again do something very bad, like giving again everyone I'm going to change this to group objects. So this object only. And there, right members. So that one little permission then, obviously write all properties would include that, then allows anybody or anybody that's been granted that right to go into that group and remove or add members. And if that group is itself a member of domain admins, again, that one tiny little permission on that one group then makes the members or anybody with that permission on that group, in this case, a full domain admin. So you might be saying, yeah, but how often does this happen? It does. I'm here to tell you because I've audited a lot of corporate, large and medium domains, and you find this if you look for it. And you can be sure that the bad guys are looking for it. And of course, Active Directory tends to be around for decades, and so this stuff accretes over time. Group policy objects. So just think, computers, obediently apply whatever configuration settings and security policies are entered in a group policy object. So if I can edit the group policy object, then I essentially have admin authority over all of the computers to which that GPO is applied. And then if that GPO is applied to domain controllers, why I then ultimately have admin authority to Active Directory itself, because I can reconfigure the security of the domain controllers. Remember that there could very well be other group policy objects besides just the default domain controllers policy object. And write access is the key thing on group policy objects. There are a couple others. In fact, let's just bring up the GPO for a second. Okay, going to the group policy object, we're going to edit it. Sorry, we want the delegation tab and then advanced. So again, this is a nice capability because GPOs are objects like anything else, so we can delegate the authority to just edit GPOs if that's appropriate. But again, it becomes very powerful, especially if this is a GPO applied to domain controllers. So we'll put Bob in here and we'll say, we'll limit this to just group policy objects, which internally is referred to as group policy container objects. And then, there we go. Some of the key things that you want to watch out here, the UI has changed a little bit, but I'm looking for GP link and GP options. Let's see here, let's get this back to group policy container. And I'd prefer for you to see it in the actual UI. Here we go. For some reason, the UI isn't cooperating with me right now, but I'll try to find it while we are handling the question and answers. But there are two properties within group policy objects that control not just the settings, which is the write all properties permission, but there's also the ability to enable or disable a GPO and to configure whether or not it overrides lower group policy objects. So normally lower GPOs override upper GPOs if there's a conflict in policy. But if we click the no override setting right there, if we enforce it, why then that now makes that GPO take precedence over all of the lower ones. And so someone who only has authority up at an upper organizational unit could create a GPO there, then click link enforced, and it would overwrite whatever settings were defined lower down. And that is all based upon whether or not you have the ability to change GP options and the GP link properties of the group policy object. So the reason I'm getting down into the weeds here is to illustrate that it can get quite convoluted, but there are indirect routes for getting admin authority that, unless you know to look for them, and unless you have the ability to hopefully automatically search and report on these and extract the information, then it at some point becomes so difficult to assess all of this that invariably you're going to have blind spots to all of the different ways that certain people have gained admin authority throughout the domain. All right, so finally, your organizational units are very important. And just think about a file server. On a file server, normally you control permissions not on the individual file level, but on the folder level, right? Well, likewise, in Active Directory, you organize objects into organizational units and sub-OUs and parent OUs. Permissions normally flow down through inheritance. So everything that we've talked about so far can also be granted at the OU level. In addition to that, it's at the OU level that you can give somebody the authority to create objects. So normally it would only be account operators or like domain admins that could create a new user object. But I can easily go to a specific organizational unit somewhere, low down in the hierarchy of a domain. And on that particular organizational unit, I could grant Bob the authority to create new user accounts. And so now all of a sudden, he's got that ability. You'll never know if you're only looking at your group memberships. Okay. Now, let's leave the core functionality of Active Directory. So those are all of the ways built into Active Directory proper that you can get admin authority. But now let's look at the broader picture and think about security dependencies. Security dependencies. So any system, application, account, or other entity upon which Active Directory has a security dependency, those systems now become just as important. They become the same level of security as your domain controllers, which we would normally call tier 0. So what are some examples? Well, let's say you have your on-prem Active Directory integrated with Entra running up in Azure, and you're doing that with Entra Connect, and that's a good thing. But just be aware, whatever server where Entra Connect is running, that server is a tier 0 server. And if I can break into that server, I could ultimately, with the proper skills or hacker tools, I could then take over Active Directory, because in most cases, Entra Connect has the ability to maybe do things like password resets. There's certain things that can replicate down, or synchronize down, I should say, from Azure to your local on-prem AD. Plus, password synchronization works the opposite direction. So there's definitely access to secrets there. What do you have a Active Directory recovery tool? If so, that's a good thing. There are fantastic products out there. I think Netrix has one that will recover Active Directory even if you face the type of attack that, for instance, Maersk faced from a Ukrainian targeted attack, and not by the Ukrainians, but an attack that was targeting Ukrainian companies, and Maersk ended up being a collateral damage. Had they had Active Directory recovery tools, they would have been able to weather that storm a lot easier than what they did. But just be aware that the systems upon which those tools are running and the tool itself, if I have privileged access, or if I can compromise the system or the application and gain privileged access, why I now have privileged access to Active Directory. Identity and access management systems, or virtualization infrastructure. Are your domain controllers virtual machines? Well, now your hypervisors and then whatever hypervisor virtualization management software that you're using, those now become tier 0 systems. They become just as important as your domain controllers to security. And this is not an exhaustive list. What I'm trying to do is give you enough examples for you to really see what is a security dependency, and the fact that, and this is not specific to Active Directory, right? This is another fundamental of cybersecurity, that any entity that has a security dependency on another entity, and that could be like what we show here, a user account, hardware, a program, well then whatever threats and vulnerabilities, whatever attack surface that entity has, whatever unpatched vulnerabilities, et cetera, all of that then should be considered as being exposed on whatever objects have that security dependency. So let's just give a concrete example. Let's say that we have Intraconnect running on a server here. And let's say that server is not patched, or let's say there's a local user account on that server that has admin authority and an easily guessed password. It's a password that's showing up on these hacked password lists. So if I can break into that server, then I can break into Active Directory. So basically, whatever vulnerabilities or attack surface or threats that this server has, we should consider Active Directory as inheriting all of those vulnerabilities, as its attack surface expanding to be whatever the attack surface, additively to whatever the attack surface that system is upon which it has a security dependency. So what are the security dependencies of your Active Directory? Well, here's a really important one, and that is the workstations. So think about all those users where you identify, using the techniques that I've provided so far. So now you've built up a full list of all the user accounts that have some amount of privileged access to your Active Directory. The next question is, what computers are they logging on at with that privileged account, especially workstations? All computers, but especially workstations. Where are they logging on with that privileged account? Those workstations now get drug in and become tier 0 as well. And I'm stressing workstations because that's where we do really dangerous things like browsing the web or opening up documents, Office documents from email attachments. Those are two of the most dangerous activities, other than downloading programs and installing and running them on a computer, that anybody does. And it's workstations where we do that the most, right? So if you are performing those kinds of actions on the same computer where you have logged on in the past or will log on in the future as an admin, then we're really exposing Active Directory to a lot of risk. And that's true even if we're performing those actions under a different account. There's just too many vulnerabilities and attack vectors on Windows workstations that allow users, or bad guys, I should say, that allow bad guys to laterally move from one account to another on a given system. And part of this is pass the hash, other credential harvesting attacks, but there's also other privilege elevation methods, and just the fact, if I can execute code on a computer, then that makes anything else on that system and any other user who may have left credential artifacts out there at risk. So we really need to be implementing, well, I'll get to that in a second. I was going to bring up secure administrative workstations, but we'll get to that as we go along here. So at the end of the day, the compromise of any system upon which Active Directory has a security dependency then means that it's a compromise potentially of Active Directory. And here I have another scenario for you. Again, these are not exhaustive, but hopefully they will help you grasp the concepts that you can then apply to your specific environment. In this case, we have our on-prem Active Directory environment. There's a domain controller there. And then we also have an Azure infrastructure environment. We have a virtual machine running up in the Azure cloud, and that's where our Active Directory recovery tool is working. And kudos on us for having a recovery solution implemented for Active Directory. However, this virtual machine is just an object in the resource manager set of objects of this Azure tenant, and whoever has admin authority to this Azure tenant or to that resource group within Azure, then they ultimately have admin authority to that computer. And if that computer is one where our on-prem AD has a security dependency, then ultimately we have admin authority back down to our on-prem Active Directory. Now let's say this user, this Azure admin, they may not even be involved in Active Directory administration or in the administration of this AD recovery tool. They just happen to have admin authority to the Azure tenant. Well, let's say their workstation is vulnerable, or let's say they're performing some unsafe activities like browsing the web or opening up Office documents from email attachments. And so a bad guy, an attacker, gains access to their workstation. Well, since their workstation is one where a privileged user is logging on, in this case an Azure admin, that would allow them to compromise the Azure tenant, having compromised, or the Azure resource group, maybe just that level. Having compromised that, they can then compromise any objects, any resources running within it, such as this virtual machine where AD recovery is running. And since AD recovery has admin authority down here to Active Directory on-prem, why now we've compromised Active Directory. So that's security dependencies for you. So getting control of all of this. Well, going back to the core functionality within AD, remember there's basically three main ways that you can get admin authority through core AD Windows functionality, and that's group membership, rights assignments on domain controllers, and then permission to the right object, the right permissions to the right object within Active Directory. There's three things that we need to do with those. We need to control it, we need to alert on changes, and we need to periodically review those three things. We really need visibility and reporting and hopefully change tracking on those things, because otherwise there's a lot of manual work involved. We also need to implement secure administrative workstations, or SAWs, SAWs. But that's not enough. We need to know who are all of our privileged accounts through any way, shape, or form. And then we need to carefully monitor what systems are those accounts logging on as. And every time we see that account logging on to another system, ideally, we would then check, hopefully in an automated way, is that a blessed tier 0 system? If it's not classified as a tier 0 system with all of the appropriate security controls, why then we need to alert. That's either a violation or an intrusion. If it's just an admin forgetting, we've got to follow up on that. We've got to then perform sanitation on that system. We need to reset the password of at least that account, and we've got to make sure it doesn't happen again. Then we need to do what I would call continuous discovery of all adjacent and lower tier systems, or basically what I'm saying is we need to do continuous discovery of all systems upon which Active Directory has a security dependency, and all systems upon which those systems have a security dependency. So let's talk about visibility a little bit. It's not a simple matter even to get a list of all the privileged users in AD. It's not a simple matter in a lot of environments just to get a list of everybody who's a member of domain admins because of group nesting and the fact that groups can be on different domains. So if that's not simple, let alone is it simple to get a list of all the application systems and accounts upon which AD has a security dependency. This requires vigilance, it requires detective work, and it requires that we have good visibility, reporting capability, search capability into security logs, into rights assignments, into permissions on AD objects, organizational units, and so on. Visibility into logon activity, and a good knowledge of our users groups, OUs, and permissions thereon. And I left out group policy objects here. So how can you get that kind of visibility? You can become an expert and basically build your career around PowerShell, or you can get something like what Jennifer is going to show us next. Jennifer, I'm going to turn things over to you. You've got some really mature, powerful capabilities there with Netrix Auditor, and I'm interested in the folks seeing it.
Awesome. Let me share my screen. And you should be able to see it, Netrix Auditor. Okay, awesome, cool. So yeah, thanks Randy for kind of the setup there in terms of getting into Netrix Auditor to get that visibility into your privileged users, as well as the activity that they're doing and how they're getting their access. I'm gonna start by showing you how Netrix Auditor can lay out who your privileged users are by looking both at group membership as well as the permissions that the users have to Active Directory objects, similar to what Randy was talking about in his section. And then I'll get into more of the visibility around the changes that are taking place so that you can actively monitor these things and alert on suspicious activity. So getting into your privileged users. So here we have number of data sources that we support, but focusing in specifically on Active Directory, we have reports specifically that already list out all of your administrative group members, as well as effective group membership if you want to look up other groups and kind of spill out the nesting there. The administrative group members report will already show you any nested members as well. So here you can see all of the members that are part of my administrators group in this case, and you can see all of the other administrative groups that Randy called out, things like account operators, backup operators. Of course, you have domain admins, enterprise admins, and you can get a list of all of the users in those groups and make sure that they are aligned with what you would expect in your organization. Similarly, Netrix Auditor makes it really easy to subscribe to any of these reports and get them sent out to your email or get them uploaded to a file share in case you get audited and you need to show that you're staying on top of who your administrative members are. Additionally, we can look at all of the object permissions in Active Directory and have a way to report on that as well. So here you can see we're going to be looking at the top level directory in this case, but you can also drill into specific objects. So this is just looking at my SB Cloud Lab domain, but you can drill into specific OUs or users and find people who have access against those things. So in this case, I'll look at anyone getting their access through a group or directly on the domain. And like I mentioned, we'll see anyone who has additional permissions. So here we can see which users have access to this domain, the means granted, whether that's directly or through a group. And if I want to see what permissions the user has, I can quickly click in and drill into their permissions. So in this case, I can see Axel has all of these permissions on the domain, including things like creating users or creating child objects. And then you can also see which groups Axel is a part of that could be granting those permissions. So in this case, he's a member of the information security group. So we saw earlier that we were looking at group membership of kind of those built-in administrative groups, but making sure that you're also staying on top of group membership and the other administrative groups you may have using like the effective group membership report, for example. You'll be able to monitor your privileged users. So here you can see, in this case, I'm looking at the domain admins group. Like I said, we'll be able to spill out any nesting. So in this case, everyone is getting their access to this group directly, but if they were in a nested group, you would be able to see that as well. And you can filter this here for other groups in your environment. All right, so that was kind of a high level of just finding your administrative users, knowing who they are. I want to get into some of the activity that we'll be able to report on, especially any changes to the groups that we just saw, any permissions changes, etc. So I'm going to come back out and take a look at the activity record search. So this makes it easy to search for any activity happening in your environment. Like I mentioned, we support a number of different data sources, but drilling in a little bit to Active Directory. Here you can see all of the changes that are happening to Active Directory. If someone is modifying permissions on a container or on a user, for example, here you can see in the details field what was modified. So in this case, this admin SD holder container, we added a user to have read permissions on that container. And then from here, you can include or exclude things in your filter or in your search to make it more actionable. So looking at some of the scenarios that Randy brought up earlier, if I wanted to specifically look at group policy changes in my environment, here I can see permissions changes to group policy objects. So in this case, let me get more details here. So in this case, I can see what was modified as in the default domain controller policy, as well as what permissions were changed. So in this case, we added David Simpson to that ACL there. And then if I want to see any changes to the group policy objects themselves, here I have an example. Again, looking at some of those sensitive policies like user rights assignments, you can see any changes. So here, this is backup files and directories, as well as restore files and directories. And you can see the before and after values of that particular object. So again, comparing the before to the after, I can see that David Simpson was added to that right. Like I mentioned, it's really quick to add additional filters here to make it more actionable. So if I specifically wanted to look for any time change was made to one of my user rights assignments, I can add that to the filters list. And from here, we can create an alert if we want to be alerted anytime a change like this happens. So you can name the alert whatever you like. And then you'll just add yourself to the recipients list. The filters will carry over from our search. So you can also add additional filters if you want to exclude certain users or exclude changes from certain workstations. We could do that as well. And you can also implement a response action, which will basically be a PowerShell script that runs when the alert is triggered to further give you more control of these changes. All right. And then the other activity that I wanted to kind of search for here is any logon activity. So here I will focus a little bit more on logon activity, and we'll show you all of the logons in your environment authenticating into Active Directory. And like I mentioned, really quick to add additional filters. So for example, if I specifically wanted to monitor any logons coming from users in my administrators group, I can add that as a filter. And here I'll see, like I mentioned, all of the logons from users in this group, as well as which workstation they're logging in from, which DC authenticated the change. And if I wanted to, let's say, exclude any logons to the domain controller, I can exclude that from my search. And here I'll have all of the administrators logging on to servers outside of my domain controller. From here, like I mentioned, you can save this as a report or create an alert, and then you can also export the data right from here to an Excel sheet or CSV sheet if you want to look into which workstations are showing up here. So in addition to being able to search for the activity in your environment and create custom alerts, we do also have a lot of out-of-the-box alerts that you can just turn on and start monitoring your environment. So things like accounts getting enabled or disabled, but specifically for kind of these privilege elevation things, we can look at any members added to a privilege group, as well as any group membership changes, object permission changes in Active Directory. So if I click into one of these alerts, you'll see it looks really similar to when we created a custom alert. So these are the filters in this case for members added to a privilege group. So things like domain admins, enterprise admins, schema admins, and then you can add additional groups here like account operators, backup operators. So you'll just turn on those alerts, you'll add yourself to the recipients list, and you'll be able to get notified anytime those changes happen. Cool. And then quickly touching on some of the other functionality that we have in here. If I come into report, you can see we're able to, like I mentioned, report on all of the permissions in Active Directory, including like group membership. So who has permissions to modify all of your objects there. But we can also monitor permissions on some of these other data sources, so things like Windows Server, keeping track of who your local admins are, making sure you know who are in your local users and groups are all reports that we can run here from that single pane of glass, and as well as monitoring any changes to those local admin groups so that you're able to report an alert on that activity. And then similar for things like VMware, if you wanted to monitor all of the permissions in VMware, you can look it up either by object or by account. So in this case, if you wanted to look up everyone who has access to the data center, you'll be able to find all of those permissions as well as report on any changes to permissions in VMware and look up a user. If you want to drill in and see everywhere that user has access, you can do that as well. So yeah. And then finally, the last thing that I'll call out here for Networks Auditor is a lot of the risks that we find in Active Directory or Windows, we roll up into a risk assessment, so you can come in and view the top risks. And it includes things like stale users or users with their password set to never expire, but focusing a little bit more on kind of the privileged accounts, making sure that you're staying on top of how many users have administrative permissions in your environment, or any administrative group membership sprawl that would be looking again at the local admins in your environment and making sure that they don't deviate from your expected values. So by default, we'll be looking for administrator and domain admins, but that can be customized. And then like I mentioned, with all of the reports, you can quickly subscribe to them. So hopefully you'll have all green risk levels at one point. And so once you start seeing those red and yellow indicators, you'll know to start investigating. So here you'll just subscribe, set up the schedule, and you'll be able to get those sent to your inbox every day, week, or month. All right. So that was kind of a high-level overview of what I wanted to look at with Networks Auditor. I think we were able to look at a lot of the different risk factors and attack paths that Randy mentioned. So
yeah, and you do a great job with the visibility, but also with the analysis. I've got some good questions for you if you're ready, Jennifer.
Yeah, sure.
So John asked, can you search for specific permission types? For instance, any users that have been delegated password change capabilities?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me come back to the permissions report for Active Directory. And it would be in the object permissions. So for resetting passwords, the filters that we'll be able to kind of filter on here are going to be here. So these will be the ones that are available to you. I don't believe reset password comes out of the box here, but things like read permissions versus modify permissions, you can filter specifically for those permission sets.
Yeah, I'm sure you can search on that. It may change depending upon what type of objects you select. Jennifer Keith asks, so if you're able to view prior activity, does that mean that there's a database or storage? He says for events from the domain controller, for events that are triggered, and what are the requirements for this database? He says, because we, ingest just 25 security events to our SIEM each day, and that translates to 300 gigabytes. But you're not doing this based just upon events. Are you going and basically doing snapshots of objects in AD and then recording the deltas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are doing snapshots of your Active Directory, and then Randy explained it perfectly. We're finding the deltas there and pulling all of that information back into a database. So yeah, there is a SQL Server database component here to allow you to search for that activity, and hopefully that answered your question. But yeah, we are looking at the events, pulling it back into a database and reporting on it here.
Francis says, is the alert action immediately? Is the alert action immediate? How long before Netrix sends email notifications of a triggered alert? In other words, how long is it before Netrix is aware of a change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the last question leads in nicely to it. Like I mentioned, how we're picking up the events is by looking at your Active Directory, finding the deltas, and then pulling it back. So that does happen on a scheduled basis. So I would say at most for Active Directory changes, it would take about 10 minutes to get that alert sent to you. So that's how frequently we would scan and pull back that data.
Good. Mm-hmm. Seth asks, does Networks Auditor have a connector to send these alerts to a SIEM?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have connectors, and they are free, but here you'll be able to, and you can find this information on our website as well, but just to show you kind of the add-ons that we have out of the box, we can send to a lot of the major SIEMs out there, Splunk, etc. And then we also have another SIEM integration that sends it in the CEF form, so you can send it to other SIEMs as well.
Jacques says, could we see the behavior anomalies functionality as well? I guess there's something in there.
Yeah.
That they must have seen.
Sure. So, and before I get into the behavior anomalies here, just a little bit of background on how that works. Let me come back to our alert settings. So with our out-of-the-box alerts, as well as any custom alerts you may want to set up, we have a risk score associated here with it. So for example, if a user is getting deleted or a user is disabling a bunch of accounts, you'll get a risk score assigned to that user. And then the behavior anomalies will look at the users with the most risk. So that's really helpful if maybe you don't want to be notified every time there's a failed logon, right? But you do want to kind of keep track of the users who are failing to log on the most. Their risk will accumulate there, and where it kind of pulls together is like in your question in the behavior anomalies dashboard. So here I have the users that have the top risk in my environment. I can see additional information about the user here, which groups they're a member of, who their manager is. And then if I double click into it, I can see which alerts they're triggering as well as when those alerts were triggered.
Awesome. Nahar says, can we detect bloodhound activity?
So we would not be able to detect bloodhound activity with Networks Auditor, but if that is something of interest, we do have other products in our portfolio. So if you look up Networks Threat Manager and if you want to discuss that, definitely happy to do so.
Abdul wonders, can you take actions from this tool, like blocking admin logins to a server?
Yeah, that's a good question. So coming back into some of our alerts, a lot of the action that will take place will be in the form of a response action, which, like I mentioned, is a custom PowerShell script. So you can add any parameters like the user who triggered the alert or the workstation it came from, et cetera, into your script. And we have some examples of this on our website, but things like moving users to a quarantine OU or disabling users will come through a response action.
All right, awesome. We still got some more here. This is great.
Great questions, great questions.
Yeah. Rob says, how is the data gathered? Does it require an agent or sensor on each endpoint? Or is it run with an account that needs rights to the information?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are agentless in our approach. So this will come from an account that has the proper permissions to pull this data back. And you can also use a GMSA to further secure it. But yeah, it would be a domain account that has permissions to your domain.
And can you handle multiple domains, multiple forests, Keith asks?
Yeah, we can handle multi-domain environments as well.
Let's see here. And so it's still one Networks Auditor.
Yeah, correct. Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So it'll still be all in one like reporting dashboard if that's what he's asking. Yep.
Tom asks, are the logs directly from the domain controller or are there other log sources? Are you able to reliably tell when an account is not authenticating? This is a little bit longer question here. Bear with me. I've got a background. We've struggled in the past with cleaning up stale accounts as the AD last logon timestamp is unreliable. And by the way, are you using the last logon timestamp, that particular field, and I'm sure you guys are grabbing the right field, is up to date within 14 days by default. So at any rate, I'll give it back to you, Jennifer.
Yeah, that's kind of a long question. I think there's a couple of questions in there. So yeah, we do pull the events back from the domain controller to report on here, especially for all of the Active Directory ones. Of course, if it's like Windows changes or VMware changes, we'll pull it from those event logs and pull it back into Networks Auditor. And then in addition to just the event log data, like I mentioned, we would also pull in like snapshot data. So that would be another way to see if something changed. And for some reason, we couldn't pull back the actual like event log data, like maybe it got overwritten or cleared, et cetera. But we'll at least show you that, hey, between yesterday and today, like someone was added to your domain, like, or Bob was added to your domain admins group. So that's that's how we're reporting on the events there. And then I think the other question was around the stale users cleanup. So yeah, we do use the last logon timestamp for Active Directory. Like Randy said, updated every 14 days or so. Curious to hear like what your issues were with cleaning up users in the past. Like I mentioned, we have a couple of solutions in our portfolio that can help you, identify and clean up those stale users, Networks Auditor being one of them, but we are using the last logon timestamp. So that's how we're finding the stale users.
And we got one more that just came in. Shroth says, how can you get complete data on nested groups? So do you have a way of just saying, show me ultimately all the users regardless of group nesting that are like domain admins or something like that?
Yeah, so the reports that I showed earlier will have that, and maybe it was like hard to tell because I didn't have any nesting groups in my environment, but both the effective group membership.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. This one will show you any groups and or any users that are a member of the group, including any nesting. So let me come back and pull up the specific column. So here are the membership type. Like I mentioned, hard to tell because all of them are directly in my case. But if they had any nested groups or anyone that was a member of a group that's a member of the domain admins group, they would also show up here. And then it'll just have a membership type of group, and it'll be hyperlinked so you can see which groups that user is directly a member of.
All right, awesome. Well, I think we got just about everybody's question answered, and I'm always happy when I see questions because it means we were doing something that was relevant. And thank you very much. You did a great job showing us Netrix. And folks, thank you for spending time with us. We hope this was valuable to you. We're getting some good comments on it, so that makes me feel good. And we'll be in touch again soon. Look in your email for a link to the recording, and have a good day, everybody.